Slavery in ancient Rome played an important role in society and the economy. Besides manual labor, slaves performed many domestic services, and might be employed at highly skilled jobs and professions. Teachers, accountants, and physicians were often slaves. Greek slaves in particular might be highly educated. Unskilled slaves, or those sentenced to slavery as punishment, worked on farms, in mines, and at mills. Their living conditions were brutal, and their lives short. Slaves were considered property under Roman law and had no legal personhood. Unlike Roman citizens, they could be subjected to corporal punishment, sexual exploitation, torture, and summary execution. The testimony of a slave could not be accepted in a court of law unless the slave was tortured, a practice based on the belief that slaves in a position to be privy to their master's affairs would be too virtuously loyal to reveal damaging evidence unless coerced. Over time, however, slaves gained increased legal protection, including the right to file complaints against their masters. Attitudes changed in part because of the influence among the educated elite of the Stoics, whose egalitarian views of humanity extended to slaves. Roman slaves could hold property which, despite the fact that it belonged to their masters, they were allowed to use as if it were their own. Skilled or educated slaves were allowed to earn their own money, and might hope to save enough to buy their freedom. Such slaves were often freed by the terms of their master's will, or for services rendered. A notable example of a high-status slave was Tiro, the secretary of Cicero. Tiro was freed before his master's death, and was successful enough to retire on his own country estate, where he died at the age of 99. Rome differed from Greek city-states in allowing freed slaves to become citizens. After manumission, a male slave who had belonged to a Roman citizen enjoyed not only passive freedom from ownership, but active political freedom, including the right to vote. A slave who had acquired libertas was thus a libertus in relation to his former master, who then became his patron. As a social class, freed slaves were libertini, though later writers used the terms libertus and libertinus interchangeably. Libertini were not entitled to hold public office or state priesthoods, nor could they achieve senatorial rank. During the early empire, however, freedmen held key positions in the government bureaucracy, so much so that Hadrian limited their participation by law. Any future children of a freedman would be born free, with full rights of citizenship. Verni were slaves born within a household or on a family farm or agricultural estate. There was a stronger social obligation to care for verni, whose epitaphs sometimes identify them as such, and at times they would have been the children of free males of the household. The general Latin word for slave was servus. A major source of slaves had been Roman military expansion during the Republic. The use of former soldiers as slaves led perhaps inevitably to a series of en masse armed rebellions, the Servile Wars, the last of which was led by Spartacus. During the Pax Romana of the early Roman Empire, emphasis was placed on maintaining stability, and the lack of new territorial conquest dried up this supply line of human trafficking. To maintain an enslaved workforce, increased legal restrictions on freeing slaves were put into place. Escaped slaves would be hunted down and returned. Origins. In his Institutionis, the Roman jurist Gaius wrote that slavery is a human invention and not found in nature. Indeed, it was that other human invention, war, which provided the bulk of slaves, but they were also the bounty of piracy, or the product of breeding. Gaius, as translated and quoted by Nick Fields, the 1st century BCE Greek historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus indicates that the Roman institution of slavery began with the legendary founder Romulus giving Roman fathers the right to sell their own children into slavery, and kept growing with the expansion of the Roman state. Slave ownership was most widespread throughout the Roman citizenry from the Second Punic War to the 4th century CE. The Greek geographer Strabo records how an enormous slave trade resulted from the collapse of the Seleucid Empire. The 12 Tables, Rome's oldest legal code, has brief references to slavery, indicating that the institution was of long standing. In the tripartite division of law by the jurist Ulpian, slavery was an aspect of the ius gentium, the customary international law held in common among all peoples. The law of nations was neither natural law, which existed in nature and governed animals as well as humans, nor civil law, which was the body of laws specific to a people. All human beings are born free under natural law, but slavery was held to be a practice common to all nations, who might then have specific civil laws pertaining to slaves. In ancient warfare, the victor had the right under the ius gentium to enslave a defeated population. However, the ius gentium was not a legal code, and any force it had depended on reasoned compliance with standards of international conduct, slavery and warfare. Throughout the Roman period, many slaves for the Roman market were acquired through warfare. Many captives were either brought back as war booty or sold to traders, and ancient sources cite anywhere from hundreds to tens of thousands of such slaves captured in each war. These wars included every major war of conquest from the monarchical period to the imperial period, as well as the social and Samnite wars. The prisoners taken or retaken after the 3 Roman servile wars also contributed to the slave supply, while warfare during the Republic provided the largest figures for captives. Warfare continued to produce slaves for Rome throughout the imperial period. Piracy has a long history of adding to the slave trade, and the period of the Roman Republic was no different. Piracy was particularly affluent in Cilicia, where pirates operated with impunity from a number of strongholds. Pompey was credited with effectively eradicating piracy from the Mediterranean in 67 BCE. Although large-scale piracy was curbed under Pompey and controlled under the Roman Empire, it remained a steady institution, and kidnapping through piracy continued to contribute to the Roman slave supply. Augustine lamented the wide-scale practice of kidnapping in North Africa in the early 5th century CE. Trade and economy. During the period of Roman imperial expansion, the increase in wealth amongst the Roman elite and the substantial growth of slavery transformed the economy. Although the economy was dependent on slavery, Rome was not the most slave-dependent culture in history. Among the Spartans, for instance, the slave class of Helots outnumbered the free by about 7 to 1, according to Herodotus. Delos in the eastern Mediterranean was made a free port in 166 BC and became one of the main market venues for slaves. Multitudes of slaves who found their way to Italy were purchased by wealthy landowners in need of large numbers of slaves to labor on their estates. Historian Keith Hopkins noted that it was land investment and agricultural production which generated great wealth in Italy, and considered that Rome's military conquest and the subsequent introduction of vast wealth and slaves into Italy had effects comparable to widespread and rapid technological innovations. Augustus imposed a 2% tax on the sale of slaves, estimated to generate annual revenues of about 5 million sesterces, a figure that indicates some 250,000 sales. The tax was increased to 4% by 43 CE. Slave markets seem to have existed in every city of the empire, but outside Rome the major center was Ephesus. Demography. Estimates for the prevalence of slavery in the Roman Empire vary. Estimates of the percentage of the population of Italy who were slaves range from 30 to 40% in the 1st century BC. Upwards of 2 to 3 million slaves in Italy by the end of the 1st century BCE, about 35% to 40% of Italy's population. For the empire as a whole, the slave population has been estimated at just under 5 million, representing 8 to 10% of the total population of 50 to 60 million plus inhabitants. An estimated 49% of all slaves were owned by the elite, who made up less than 1.5% of the empire's population. About half of all slaves worked in the countryside, where they were a small percentage of the population except on some large agricultural, especially imperial, estates. The remainder, the other half, were a significant percentage, 25% or more, in towns and cities as domestics and workers in commercial enterprises and manufactories. Roman slavery was not based on race. Slaves were drawn from all over Europe and the Mediterranean, including Gaul, Hispania, Germany, Britannia, the Balkans, Greece. Generally, slaves in Italy were indigenous Italians, with a minority of foreigners born outside of Italy estimated at 5% of the total in the capital, where their number was largest. At its peak, those from outside of Europe were predominantly of Greek descent, while the Jewish ones never fully assimilated into Roman society, remaining an identifiable minority. The slaves had higher mortality rates and lower birth rates than natives, and were sometimes even subjected to mass expulsions. The average recorded age at death for the slaves of the city of Rome was extraordinarily low, 17.5 years. Auctions and sales. New slaves were primarily acquired by wholesale dealers who followed the Roman armies. Many people who bought slaves wanted strong slaves, mostly men. Child slaves cost less than adults, although the sources state their price as higher. Julius Caesar once sold the entire population of a conquered region in Gaul, no fewer than 53,000 people, to slave dealers on the spot. Within the empire, slaves were sold at public auction or sometimes in shops, or by private sale in the case of more valuable slaves. Slave dealing was overseen by the Roman fiscal officials called quaestors. Sometimes slaves stood on revolving stands, and around each slave for sale hung a type of plaque describing his or her origin, health, character, intelligence, education, and other information pertinent to purchases. Prices varied with age and quality, with the most valuable slaves fetching prices equivalent to thousands of today's dollars. Because the Romans wanted to know exactly what they were buying, slaves were presented naked. The dealer was required to take a slave back within 6 months if the slave had defects that were not manifest at the sale, or make good the buyer's loss. Slaves to be sold with no guarantee were made to wear a cap at the auction. Debt slavery. Nexum was a debt bondage contract in the early Roman Republic. Within the Roman legal system, it was a form of emancipation, though the terms of the contract would vary. Essentially, a free man pledged himself as a bond slave as surety for a loan. He might also hand over his son as collateral, although the bondsman could expect to face humiliation and some abuse. As a legal citizen, he was supposed to be exempt from corporal punishment. Nexum was abolished by the Lex Poetelia Papiria in 326 BCE, in part to prevent abuses to the physical integrity of citizens who had fallen into debt bondage. Roman historians illuminated the abolition of Nexum with a traditional story that varied in its particulars. Basically, Annexus, who was a handsome but upstanding youth, suffered sexual harassment by the holder of the debt. In one version, the youth had gone into debt to pay for his father's funeral. In others, he had been handed over by his father. In all versions, he is presented as a model of virtue. Historical or not, the cautionary tale highlighted the incongruities of subjecting one free citizen to another's use, and the legal response was aimed at establishing the citizen's right to liberty, as distinguished from the slave or social outcast. Cicero considered the abolition of Nexum primarily a political maneuver to appease the common people. The law was passed during the conflict of the orders, when plebeians were struggling to establish their rights in relation to the hereditary privileges of the patricians. Although Nexum was abolished as a way to secure a loan, debt bondage might still result after a debtor defaulted. Types of work. Slaves worked in a wide range of occupations that can be roughly divided into 5 categories. household or domestic, imperial or public, urban, crafts and services, agriculture, and mining. Epitaphs record at least 55 different jobs a household slave might have, including barber, butler, cook, hairdresser, handmaid, wet nurse or nursery attendant, teacher, secretary, seamstress, accountant, and physician. A large elite household might be supported by a staff of hundreds. The living conditions of slaves attached to a domus, while inferior to those of the free persons they lived with, were sometimes superior to that of many free urban poor in Rome. Household slaves likely enjoyed the highest standard of living among Roman slaves, next to publicly owned slaves, who were not subject to the whims of a single master. Imperial slaves were those attached to the emperor's household, the familia caesarish. In urban workplaces, the occupations of slaves included fullers, engravers, shoemakers, bakers, mule drivers, and prostitutes. Farm slaves probably lived in more healthful conditions. Roman agricultural writers expect that the workforce of a farm will be mostly slaves, managed by a villicus, who was often a slave himself. Slaves numbering in the tens of thousands were condemned to work in the mines or quarries, where conditions were notoriously brutal. Damnatia in metallim were convicts who lost their freedom as citizens, forfeited their property to the state, and became serva pena, slaves as a legal penalty. Their status under the law was different from that of other slaves. They could not buy their freedom, be sold, or be set free. They were expected to live and die in the mines. Imperial slaves and freedmen worked in mine administration and management. In the late Republic, about half the gladiators who fought in Roman arenas were slaves, though the most skilled were often free volunteers. Successful gladiators were occasionally rewarded with freedom. However, gladiators, being trained warriors and having access to weapons, were potentially the most dangerous slaves. At an earlier time, many gladiators had been soldiers taken captive in war. Spartacus, who led the Great Slave Rebellion of 73-71 BCE, was a rebel gladiator. Servus publicus. A servus publicus was a slave owned not by a private individual, but by the Roman people. Public slaves worked in temples and other public buildings both in Rome and in the municipalities. Most performed general, basic tasks as servants to college of pontiffs, magistrates, and other officials. Some well-qualified public slaves did skilled office work such as accounting and secretarial services. They were permitted to earn money for their personal use. Because they had an opportunity to prove their merit, they could acquire a reputation and influence, and were sometimes deemed eligible for manumission. During the Republic, a public slave could be freed by a magistrate's declaration, with the prior authorization of the Senate. In the imperial era, liberty would be granted by the emperor. Municipal public slaves could be freed by the municipal council. Treatment and legal status. There are reports of abusive slaves by Romans, but there is little information to indicate how widespread such harsh treatment was. Cato the Elder was recorded as expelling his old or sick slaves from his house. Seneca held the view that a slave who was treated well would perform a better job than a poorly treated slave. Although in general freed slaves could become citizens, with the right to vote if they were male, those categorized as dedici suffered permanent disbarment from citizenship. The dedici were mainly slaves whose masters had felt compelled to punish them for serious misconduct by placing them in chains, branding them, torturing them to confess a crime, imprisoning them or sending them involuntarily to a gladiatorial school, or condemning them to fight with gladiator or wild beasts. Dedici were regarded as a threat to society, regardless of whether their masters' punishments had been justified, and if they came within 100 miles of Rome, they were subject to re-enslavement. Crucifixion was the capital punishment meted out specifically to slaves, traitors, and bandits. Marcus Crassus was supposed to have concluded his victory over Spartacus in the Third Servile War by crucifying 6,000 of the slave rebels along the Appian Way. Several emperors began to grant more rights to slaves as the empire grew. Claudius announced that if a slave was abandoned by his master, he became free. Nero granted slaves the right to complain against their masters in a court. And under Antoninus Pius, a master who killed a slave without just cause could be tried for homicide. Legal protection of slaves continued to grow as the empire expanded. It became common throughout the mid to late 2nd century CE to allow slaves to complain of cruel or unfair treatment by their owners. According to Marcel Mauss, in Roman times the persona gradually became synonymous with the true nature of the individual, but the slave was excluded from it. Servus non habet personam. He has no personality. He does not own his body, he has no ancestors, no name, no cognomen, no goods of his own. Rebellions and runaways. Moses Finley remarked, fugitive slaves are almost an obsession in the sources. Rome forbade the harboring of fugitive slaves, and professional slave catchers were hired to hunt down runaways. Advertisements were posted with precise descriptions of escaped slaves, and offered rewards. If caught, fugitives could be punished by being whipped, burnt with iron, or killed. Those who lived were branded on the forehead with the letters FUG, for fugitivus. Sometimes slaves had a metal collar riveted around the neck. One such collar is preserved at Rome and states in Latin, I have run away. Catch me. If you take me back to my master's own highness, you'll be rewarded. There was a constant danger of servile insurrection, which had more than once seriously threatened the Republic. The 1st century BCE Greek historian Diodorus Siculus wrote that slaves sometimes banded together to plot revolt. He chronicled the 3 major slave rebellions in 135–132 BCE, in 104–100 BCE, and in 73–71 BCE.